Following the Golden Rule with Andrew Faas is proudly supported by Remax St. Andrews. Live and vacation by the sea. Choose wisely. Choose Remax.
Hello, my name is Andrew Faas, and welcome to Following the Golden Rule.
And I'm Jay Remer, and for 26 weeks, Andy and I will be discussing the ABCs of building character. Last week, we discussed L is for loyal, and one of the comments that we got back was about St. Andrews itself, and that we hadn't actually mentioned that St. Andrews was one of the very first loyalist towns. And it's very interesting because it's a very apt word for St. Andrews still today. One of the things that strikes me particularly about St. Andrews is that a number of years ago we were designated as a National Historic District, which is very rare in Canada. There are only a handful. And the reason that it was designated that way is because it retained so much of its original character and layout from the original town plat that was laid out in 1783. And to this day, so much of the town has remained sort of intact, and the feeling of the Loyalist town has remained intact. And what strikes me most about that is that it has been done without a single historic bylaw. It has been done all by the people for centuries. And I think it's something that's very noteworthy. And so for people who may be seeking refuge from the big cities over the course of the next few months, St. Andrews is a wonderful, wonderful spot. So I just wanted to give a little plug for St. Andrews and being a loyalist town.
Well, it actually was a bit of a miss because we're right here in as you say, almost one of the early loyalist towns. More importantly, as you've alluded to it, it's remained loyal to its history. But even more importantly, its people, the citizens, both seasonal residents and locals, have been tremendously loyal to the businesses in the town. And this is something I think other communities should look at as they see people moving out of the big urban areas into smaller communities. And those communities can only survive if there is support from people coming in as entrepreneurs and creating businesses here. But the ethic of reciprocity must apply, and the ethic of reciprocity is being loyal to them, so that they can survive. So it's a bit of a miss relative to our not mentioning the obvious.
Yeah.
Another miss is that in Washington they say, if you want a friend, get a dog. And if you want unconditional love and loyalty, I can speak with some experience, having grown up with dogs and now having two beautiful Weimaraners. They are immensely loyal, and yes, they do give unconditional love.
Yeah, well, it's a great word, and I think it gave people a lot of thought. Now, this week we're going to be discussing mindful, and mindfulness. Sort of the definition of mindfulness is the quality or state of being conscious or aware of something. And another definition is it's a therapeutic technique to improve one's mental state. Now, in your article on mindfulness, you broadened the definition a bit, and I'm wondering if you could explain that a bit.
Sure, and I think the difference is in being mindful of something versus mindfulness. And yes, and it's something that I practice in terms of being mindful, or the therapeutic benefits of mindfulness. But it is limited in so much that it kind of forces people to focus on the present. And I look at it more in the context of people's actions, their comments, and their choices they make and decisions they make, and being mindful of a number of things. And so when I look at it, I look at being mindful of why we're doing whatever we're doing. Being mindful of the data and facts, and regardless of what people are saying today, facts still matter. Being mindful of the various impacts that the comment or action or choice or decision will have on others, and also being mindful of it in the context of time. So when we're faced with something, we look at it in terms of the history or the past, and then the current, and then the future state. And so those are all of the things that I think that's the way I look at it in terms of being mindful of.
Well, it's interesting because I think the key there is being mindful of all of those things sort of simultaneously. And so it's a lot of things for people to think about at once.
Yes. and there's usually no checklist that, although I will provide for a bit of a checklist later on in the program, but our capacity or ability to do that on reflex. I'm a great fan of Malcolm Blackwell, who described elevated consciousness, and I'll just quote from him. There is in all of our brains a mighty backstage process which works its will subconsciously. Through this process, we have the capacity to shift huge amounts of information, blend data, isolate telling details, and come to rapid conclusions, even in the first 2 seconds. And that comes from his book, Blink. I'm a great advocate of being able to, yes, be reflective. If you're having to pull somebody out of a burning car, you don't go through this and say, what's the checklist?
Right.
You react, and,
Right.
And subconsciously you do go through the things that you have to do. But in most situations, in comments you make, in decisions you make, and choices you make, you have more than 2 seconds in which to reflect on the things I talked about a bit earlier.
Well, you know, this is part of the purpose of this show is self-reflection, and the more we practice reflecting on our ability to be mindful and to juggle different bits of information simultaneously, with practice we get better at it, and I think that that's I think that that's one of the benefits of doing self-reflection. The more we do it, the better we are, and those knee-jerk reactions improve.
Absolutely, and so much of it, you know, as we talked about right throughout the program, starts with when we first start to learn, and I differentiate, and we talked about it a bit earlier before the program, on memorizing things. And all too often the education is focused on memorizing things versus thinking things through. and thinking things through. If you're taught to do that, that's teaching you how to learn.
That's right.
And so yes, a huge amount of the stuff you have to filter through. You can filter through, and you should filter through.
That's right. Well, I remember, you know, as we were talking, I remember we talked about the Gettysburg Address and how important, you know, of a message that is. And I volunteered that, I learned the Gettysburg Address when I was in the 7th grade. But as we talked about it, I realized that mostly what I learned was how to memorize the words and not so much what the words were actually saying.
Let's test your memory.
Yeah, let's test my memory.
No, seriously.
Well,
seriously, and we can talk about it because the Gettysburg Address is captures the mind of a very mindful person in Abraham Lincoln, and so I invite you to.
Well, you know, it's interesting because when I went to print off the Gettysburg Address, one of the things I didn't realize was that he worked on it right until he got off the train. And so this, I believe, is the latest version. It's not long, but it's a really important message for today, 150 years later. So it goes, fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all people are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
So as indicated, that comes from a very mindful person. And in the U.S., every student was expected to memorize those lines. Unfortunately, I don't think people have really learned from the lines. So that was written 150 years ago, and the situation in North America, in Canada, in the U.S. Is such that we need to reflect the way Lincoln did on the past, where we are today, and where we want to be in the future. And those words beautifully look at it in what I talked a bit earlier, being mindful in the context of time. History is so important in terms of determining the future. And there are other things in history, the Great Depression, the Second World War, and subsequent situations where we are seeing a repeat of history and a repeat of the conditions that led up to where we are today. As early as 10 years ago, if we were mindful of what occurred in the Depression, we would have forced a different outcome relative to the socioeconomic model that got expanded on. And I am so worried today that we are going to again repeat the mistakes we made just a short decade ago. So we need to be mindful of history, and we need to be mindful of what's going on today relative to the impact that the economic fallout because of the pandemic has on people. And we need to be mindful of what we can do individually and what we need to expect institutions to do collectively to create a new social economic model that factors in and is for the benefit of all, rather than in what we're facing today, it only benefits solely the privileged, elite, pampered, white, male contingent of our population, which only represents between 1 and 10%. And so when we're looking at what that new socioeconomic model is, there's a whole slew of things that we need to be mindful of, and most importantly is, where do we want the end point to be, or where do we want the future to be? And we want the future, as Lincoln said, to benefit all.
Also in your article, you gave a great example of a mindful leader. Would you like to expand on that?
Sure. Well, the best example is William DeWitt Hyde. And Hyde was president of Bowdoin College from 1885 to 1917. And I'll just quote from him because I think it covers all factors of all of the factors that people should think about when they're confronted with a situation. And he wrote, and it was in to his students, and it was an offer that he made to the students, and it was called the offer of the college.
Okay.
To students, he said, "We want you to be at home in all lands and all ages, to count nature as a familiar acquaintance, and art as an intimate friend, to gain a standard of appreciations of others' work and the criticism of your own, to carry the keys of the world's library in your pocket, and feel its resources behind you in whatever task you undertake, to make hosts of friends who are to be leaders in all walks of life, to lose yourself in generous enthusiasms and cooperate with others for common ends. This is the offer of the college for the best 4 years of your life." So that mandate of the college and promise to the students is one of the, in my view, the most mindful piece of work that I have seen. And it behooves those who influence, and that's all of us, as leaders of character, to part that kind of mandate and message and promise to the people that you're responsible for.
Well, it's a great message, and it also taps into really the crux of learning. You know, it's not to learn your ABCs. You have to learn those, but this is really teaching you how to think in a way that prepares you for going into business or carrying on a career. And I think that if a school that does that is doing the right thing.
Yes, and the same can be done with every institution and with every individual. And that's what we're trying to promote throughout these series of characteristics, and in particular understanding who you want to become, and then how do you influence those that you're responsible for.
Well, you know, Andy, this letter, M for mindful, is the halfway mark for the alphabet, and it might be a good time to reflect back on how these characters of leadership have come together and influence one another and influence us as we go through the exercise of self-reflection.
Well, it definitely, yes, it is a halfway mark, and I've got to tell you that my own reflection as we've put this together and critically thought about each letter, and I know I check myself in terms of am I mindful in making decisions, in making comments, in making choices, in situations that I'm faced with. I am mindful now, more mindful now of being authentic, mindful of being believable. I'm mindful of being courageous and dependable and equitable. I'm more mindful of being fairer, and I'm more mindful of being grateful, honest, inclusive, just, kind, and loyal. And when I went through the number of things that we have to be mindful of, I did not include being mindful of what we're putting forward here. But quite frankly, I think it's the most important thing because it reflects who we are, and it also reflects on who we want to become, and what we want to represent, and what we want to stand for, and what we want to protect, and what we want to defend, and what we want to support. And I think it's a great opportunity for us all to, particularly now, to reflect on those things that are critical in determining our destinies and the destinies of others.
So can you give us some tips on being mindful?
Sure. First off, follow the factors that I outlined earlier in the program, but I'll just add to them by kind of stealing from Tony Stolfus in his book, Coaching Questions. The first one is rational, the why and the pros and cons, and what are the options. For the whatever you comment on or decide or choose or react to. The second is intuition, and as Gladwell argues, what does your 2-second conclusion tell you and why? Third is the alignment. How consistent is it with your passion, values, and beliefs? The fourth is relationships, and what are the emotional and practical impacts of others? Counsel. What are the inputs and perspectives that you need from others? Sixth, what are the negative drivers? What and why will it be resisted or opposed? Seventh, what's the cost? What are the emotional and financial implications? Eighth, the risk, and is it worth it? Now, I'd add some to what he outlined, and that is being mindful of what you know and what you don't know. Being mindful that everyone is not open, honest, and direct. It's a reality. Being mindful that people may be telling you what they think you want to hear. And so, there's very practical tips on again, what we need to factor in when we make those comments, choices, decisions, and reactions.
Well, it's a lot to keep straight in your mind, and that's why it's important to practice it on a regular basis, ongoing basis. It's not something that you can learn and then, okay, we'll just tick that box and move along. It's a lifestyle change, and it's very much in fitting with the title of the show, Following the Golden Rule, because that's not something that you just do occasionally. It's something that it's how you live your life. And I think mindfulness is a great example of how we live our lives to the fullest.
And I believe Malcolm Gladwell is right when he said, when you master it, you can do it in 2 seconds.
Thank you, Andy, for your thoughts on being mindful. And thank you for joining us this week for this episode. Next week, we're going to replay the introduction to this series. It's important to take the time to reflect on all of the characteristics that we've outlined so far. So as you watch the introduction next week, I hope that you'll take the time to do that and maybe make a few notes about your progress. So thank you for watching tonight, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.
Following the Golden Rule with Andrew Faas is proudly supported by Remax St. Andrews. Live and vacation by the sea. Choose wisely. Choose Remax.